Well, I'm honoured to have been asked to speak here. My mum was a nurse. She came to Britain as a nurse from Barbados, trained as a nurse in Derby. And I want to start with just a reflection. I worked in the States for 12 years and I covered Hurricane Katrina. And I remember going into New Orleans and in a moment where there were literally bodies floating in the street and the hurricane, which actually didn't even land in New Orleans, it landed somewhere else, washed up all of these inequalities that everybody knew about, that nobody would have ever dared say, no, there's no inequality between black and white in America or in Louisiana, but it showed it in its barest possible way. It laid it bare. You couldn't ignore it. And of course, it wasn't the weather that discriminated. It was the discrimination that was prevalent that kind of came to the fore. And it really feels a lot, this virus really feels a lot like this, that kind of a range of inequities and inequalities that we knew to be the case um, can kind of really no longer be denied. And they can no longer be denied because they're being quantified in this kind of incredibly morbid fashion. And what it shows, and I do think there is a connection in this moment, particularly in the States, where there is also a disproportionate number of Black, Latino, and Native American people who are dying, but also here of this link between that most brazen, brutal, videoed death of George Floyd, which shows that we generally fall foul of the law of the land, and the kind of more banal deaths that aren't videoed, that don't make the headlines as such, that have become part of the bump and grind of our lives, which is this kind of COVID moment where even in the States, many more people are being killed by this disease than are being killed by the cops, and that's not a reflection on the cops. It's just it doesn't downgrade the issue of police violence, but it seeks to kind of locate the context for this economic violence and for this health violence. This in America, a black man in DC has a lower life expectancy than a man on the Gaza Strip. Now, that's not because black people don't love life. That's because the system don't love them. And so we have to kind of look at how we not just fall foul of the law of the land, but the law of probabilities, where we are more likely. It's the propensity. So I've got a pretty good job, I'm fine, but I'm more likely, we're all more likely than our counterparts who earn the same, who live in the same area, who in other ways are similar to live in overcrowded housing. Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, Bangladeshis in particular, 15 times more likely to live in overcrowded housing than white people. Well, you can see, particularly if it's multi-generational, what that could mean with COVID. More likely to live in deprived areas, more likely to be expelled from school, more likely to be a whole heap of stuff, including concentrated in particular sectors that are the most vulnerable. Now, we're talking in an NHS, Keep Our NHS public meeting. And so obviously we're going to focus on nurses, but security guards, cleaners, taxi drivers, particularly for Pakistanis outside of London. These are rural areas where we are more likely to be, and therefore more likely to be vulnerable. And then if we go back to the NHS, and this has kind of been referred to somewhat, you get a sense of, and I read Snowy White Peaks, that report by Roger Clines in 2014, the degree to which, once again, it's propensity, Black people more likely to feel like outsiders, more likely to be bullied, less likely to speak up. And all of that creates a situation where you're more likely to be put in a situation where you will get an extremely kind of heavy dose of the viral, of what you were talking about before, the viral load. And this is what systemic discrimination looks like. It's not these, there are these isolated incidents involving malevolent bigots making vengeful decisions, as we saw with George Floyd and others. And that does happen. But we wouldn't want to reduce and limit our understanding of racism to that, because there are also a range of processes built on presumption, assumption, confidence, ignorance, exclusionary, institutional, personal, professional networks that all buttress the dead weight of privilege. So that when people say, well, why did you do that? Why were you there? Why? Half the time people don't know. There's a kind of entire set of forces that have kind of located us in this place and time. Now, I just want to speak briefly about what I think, because once you talk about systemic racism and institutional racism and stuff like that, on the one hand, you do paint a picture of a set of networks instead of kind of bad people. There's no one, apart from a handful of Black people who've died after being spat on, it's not like there are people running around injecting us with this virus. That's not how it works. We are prone, we are vulnerable. But sometimes that can just let people off the hook, and they can feel like, well, if it's an institution or a system, then what can I do? But there are things that can be done. And the first and the most obvious, and it locates these demands within general demands. You see people kind of like, well, why should you be so special? Or, you know, you're trying to divide people on the grounds of race. Well, the first thing that we all need is PPE. If you're going to be working in the front line, then one of the things that would most readily protect us is the same thing that will protect everybody else. And so the demand for more PPE, for test and trace, for an extension of lockdown, all of those things, in the same way that the disease affects us disproportionately, the cure will help us disproportionately, and it will help everybody. And as is nearly always the case, whether we're talking about police accountability or issues to do with education or poverty or civil rights, the demands that Black people make are demands for everyone. It just so happens that we're the last people, we're the people at the rough end, and we're the last people often to get them. Next, I think we need an independent public inquiry. These reviews, with their limited scope, and I feel that the review that came out today, they said there's going to be another review and they were going to look at comorbidities and obesity. And I thought, well, first of all, those are connected to deprivation. And secondly, why don't you look at deprivation? Why don't you start by looking at deprivation? Because if you're just going to say, well, we adjusted it for deprivation, then they've taken out one of the kind of key elements of the problem, which is, as literally as you can say it in this moment, racism is killing us. And being Black is a pre-existing condition. Being minority, ethnic minority, is a pre-existing condition. That itself makes us vulnerable in this moment. This isn't about identity. It's about life and death. And so a full-scale public inquiry that could do for our understanding of our country, all of our countries, what Macpherson did in terms of locating systemic racism within the fabric of the country, and then talking about what you can do about it. I guess I would end just by saying that none of this is going to go away by itself. It's going to go away because we make demands, in the words of Frederick Douglass, the slave abolitionist. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And so we are going to, and it's been shown already, despite their majority, that with issues relating to the surcharge, that we can make them back down. But to do that, we have to be we have to be organized, and we have to be focused, and we have to continue to make those links, particularly in this moment, not opportunistically, but kind of actually psychically and philosophically, between those deaths that you can see videoed, the brutality and the brazenness of those deaths, and the far more numerous deaths that are taking place in a much more silent manner, which are actually joined by the connective tissue that I can't breathe. Whether you have the neck of a copper on your, the knee of a policeman on your neck, or it's that you're crying out for a ventilator, that you are asthmatic and you have to go to work, whatever it is, this notion that I can't breathe is kind of the connective tissue between this explosive moment which is taking place elsewhere, which we all feel very keenly and are kind of watching very closely, and the less explosive but actually in many ways more deadly moment that we are enduring both here and there. Thank you.